Welcome back, everybody. We are going to start our section that's going to lead us smack dab into the middle of the Civil War here in the next couple of lectures. We need to start talking about the Civil War by talking about how it is that both the North and the South get to a point where they are both ready and willing to fight each other over the issues that are on the table. And we also need to figure out what those issues are. It's always easy to boil down the Civil War just to slavery, because that's obviously the biggest difference between the two sections. But what we're going to see over the next couple of classes is that there's really more to it than just this issue of slavery that's pulling the nation apart. There are some early attempts to try and bridge the divide between the North and the South, and one of those comes in 1850 with the statehood of California. There is some concern here that because California obviously needs to be made a state, we talked about that last time, we've got the gold rush, we have so many people out there that we need to institute some law and order, and we need to allow California to have proper representation. The problem is that the South doesn't really just want to allow California to come in without having a twin. But they don't have a twin ready. There's not another southern state that's ready to come in at this point. So in order to allow California to come in by itself as a free state, there's going to be some finagling. There's going to be some brokering of deals. And the deal that we ultimately end up with here is the Compromise of 1850, which gives California its statehood without having a matching state, but also forces the North to make some sacrifices to the South. At this point, one of the big issues is that the South wants protection, long-term protection for the institution of slavery. They want some promises, they want some guarantees that as they are surrounded by states without slavery, and that they may be outnumbered by those states, that they will be offered some kind of protection. And a lot of people in the North aren't really willing to do that. In the compromise that follows, we see about 6 months of actual congressional debate. So this isn't something they were able to put together quickly. 6 months of yelling and screaming and people getting extremely upset with each other, and people offering up compromises that today we might consider to be wildly crazy. One of my favorites was someone who suggested that there be 2 presidents, one for the North and one for the South, and each of those presidents would have veto power over the other one. Obviously, that would be a drastic and fundamental change to the Constitution, and it doesn't exactly work out, although it is a little bit ironic that by 1861 we will in fact have 2 different presidents. The compromise that they decide on has a few different dimensions to it. Probably the most important is that the Compromise of 1850 removes the Compromise of 1820 as a possibility. Remember, the 1820 Compromise drew that line across the country, so we're now going to erase that line. We're going to pretend like it doesn't exist anymore, and we're going to go with the idea of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the basic idea that voters in each state will decide. So if a new state, let's say like California, is going to come into the Union, they will vote on whether or not they have slavery or not. This sounds like a really good idea, actually. You know, it kind of returns some power to the people of the state. It's self-determination at the more local level. But you'll see the problems that actually arise as a result of the idea of popular sovereignty here in a minute. Northerners want to close down the slave markets in Washington, D.C. That's something that they're going to ask the South for. People found it to be embarrassing that there was an open slave market in our national capital. You know, we were entertaining dignitaries and ambassadors, and visitors were coming to our capital city, and one of the tour stops that they would make would be the slave market. It made it look as though the federal government endorsed slavery because there were slaves being sold right next door. So we're going to get rid of the slave markets in Washington, D.C. as a result of this compromise, but the North is going to sacrifice something important. They are going to agree to what's known today as the Fugitive Slave Law. Essentially, that meant that Southerners could send bounty hunters to the North to try to find their escaped slaves. So if you're a slave in the South and you leave on the Underground Railroad and you get all the way to, let's say, Indiana, where you probably should be safe, after this compromise is passed and the fugitive slave law is passed, someone can pay a bounty hunter $100 to go to Indiana and try and find you and bring you back. And the results of the fugitive slave law are kind of disastrous. The South obviously wanted to reclaim lost property. That's how they viewed this. But because bounty hunters were getting paid as long as they brought somebody back to the South, we ended up in the 1850s with this kind of rash of kidnappings of African Americans in the North, some of whom had never even been slaves, some of whom were part of that kind of 250,000 free blacks that lived in the North. They could literally be snatched off the street, kidnapped, taken to the South, and sold on the open slave market, and there would be no ramifications for that. The fugitive slave law allows a little bit of this kind of vigilante recovery system that really goes unchecked for almost a decade. That aspect of this compromise is one of the first things that makes a lot of Northerners mad. And it most certainly made abolitionists mad, because here they've been working to help free all of these people, and no such luck now that people are going to be able to come to the North and hunt them down. The Compromise of 1850 doesn't actually solve all of our problems, although it is a temporary, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a fairly substantial wound. New Mexico, as an example, is also ready to come in as a state in 1850, but it's ready to come in as a free state. So the South actually allows California to come in, but blocks New Mexico, because New Mexico has already made its decision. Popular sovereignty or not, it doesn't have slaves, it's not going to have slaves. So the South is hoping that popular sovereignty will actually help them. That maybe some of the states like Kansas and Nebraska that are getting ready to come in, maybe they'll find an opening there. They can bring those states in as slave states. This is what the map ends up looking like after this Compromise of 1850. You can see that we've got some territories in purple. Some of these will be getting ready to come in shortly, and they'll have to wait. California's in, Texas is already in. The South, as it will exist during the Civil War, is complete at this point. But the North is not. The North is going to have additional entries coming from this territory out here that it was previously assumed nobody would really want to live out here. Obviously, our expansion, our desires for Western expansion make that a little bit different. The Oregon Territory also hasn't been organized into states yet. So the North has more states to come. The South does not. The South is locked in at this point. There are some obvious problems with the Compromise of 1850. One of those is that people in the North were extremely upset about the fugitive slave law. They battled in court. They fought people who came up to capture slaves. They absolutely objected to the law in a way that made them disobey it. We have a lot of civil disobedience with regards to the fugitive slave law. There is an idea here early on in the 1850s that one of the ways to balance out the slave states with the free states is for the United States to expand into places like Cuba and Hawaii and make those places slave states. But first of all, Hawaii and Cuba don't really want to be annexed, so we have that problem. But there's this growing idea that we're going to have to go take more territory on behalf of the South so that they feel like there is a better balance of power. Even the idea of going into Canada gets brought up again. The South at this point doesn't want to admit any new land unless it will be land that they can take slaves to. It's a pretty absolute position. The North is saying no, the South is saying, hey, no new territory unless it's a slave territory. The power struggle that follows in the 1850s also has to do with the growing importance of railroads. Railroads are really in their infancy during the 1850s, but the North is building them enthusiastically, and the South is not. This goes along with the idea that the South and internal improvements don't really go together. But there is a desire to build a transcontinental line, which means that it would run from California all the way across the country, and Northerners are willing to finance it, but they obviously want it to run through northern cities. So the original plan is to run it through places like St. Louis and Chicago. Southerners want the line to come through the South. They feel like gold coming from California would be put on those trains and it would add some value to their economy. It would be a boost. So they're even going to fight about where this line should go. And the North does try to make some fairly substantial compromises here. One of the compromises that they try to make is they purchase that little sliver of land underneath Arizona and New Mexico, because surveyors have said that if you're going to run a southern transcontinental rail line, you're going to have to run it through that territory. We didn't ask Mexico or demand that Mexico give us that sliver of land after the Mexican-American War, because it's just desert. People thought it was worthless. Now, come to find out, it's the only place that engineers feel like they can run a line from California to the rest of the South. So the Gadsden Purchase buys that little tiny sliver of land. It actually costs us $15 million, give or take, which is the same price that we paid for the Louisiana Purchase and the same price that we paid Mexico for all the rest of that territory. So Mexico got a little bit of their money back on this deal because we spent a handsome sum on it. The idea here is that these concessions are trying to alleviate the tensions between the two sections. If the South thinks they want this rail line, Congress will buy them a piece of land so they can try to have it. They're trying to find some kind of middle ground, but that's going to be easier said than done. One of the biggest problems is that popular sovereignty doesn't work as peacefully as it sounded like it might. It sounds like, if you allow voters in a territory or a state to decide whether or not they want slavery, that will make some bit of sense. The problem is that Kansas and Nebraska as a territory are going to be divided into two sections. The idea there was that by dividing them, the South hoped that one of the sections would be slave and one of the sections could then be free. They didn't really care. They really felt like Nebraska was too far north for slavery to be of any use anyway. But they had some hope for Kansas, that people would maybe be able to take slaves to Kansas and get some use out of them. As a result of this protest about what's going to happen in Kansas and Nebraska, will people go there with slaves? Will they go there to be small farmers? This is kind of an up-in-the-air debate. The Republican Party, which will be the party of Abraham Lincoln here in a few years, actually forms in regards to this fight about what's going to happen in Kansas and Nebraska. And here's what happens in the 1850s. As it's announced that these territories will get to decide their own fate when it comes to slavery, slave owners and Southerners who believe in slavery race into Kansas. They're going to at least settle there temporarily so that they can become voters and they can vote that Kansas will be a slave state. But people in the North get wind of this and they start rushing into Kansas. A lot of these people come from places like Missouri, some come from Texas. And so we have this flood of people into the territory. But the problem is the flood of people, they're on opposite sides of the spectrum. Some are free, some are slave. And when they get in the same place and they're all fighting for the right to make this state kind of in their own image, we end up with an enormous conflict. This is not a small conflict. It actually is a way to kind of foreshadow what will happen during the Civil War. Some historians have even argued that the Civil War really starts in Kansas in the 1850s. To give you an idea of how bad things get, this episode is known as Bleeding Kansas. It is a really bloody, very violent conflict. The state of Kansas, or the territory of Kansas, for a while actually functions with two separate constitutions. Lawrence, Kansas is burned to the ground during this time period. People murder each other in the streets. They burn each other's homes and barns down. We have people who steal other people's slaves, and then people who are killed in return. This violence gives everybody else in the country a pretty clear idea of how polarizing the issue of slavery can really be. People loot, they destroy printing presses and newspaper offices. We've got people kind of holding guerrilla warfare of sorts. They're hiding and shooting each other like snipers. It's really an extraordinary, ugly event. One of the things that the Republican Party forms and starts to talk about on the national level is this idea of free soil. They refer to it, sometimes you'll see it written as free labor, free soil, or free soil, free labor. The idea being that allowing people to have access to land, like farmland, will allow them to be farmers, but will also allow them to control the price of their own labor. When you work for yourself, you set your own value. And with slavery, nobody can set their own value. Nobody can compete with slaves on the labor market because obviously they work for free and nobody else can. And so this sort of debate about what to do with Kansas is what kind of propels all of the violence. You can see in this crazy cartoon that I have stuck at the bottom for you that is a caricature of Abraham Lincoln. And it's the general idea here that slavery is being forced down the throats of good, honest, free people. And that's what they wanted to try to avoid. One of the advocates for this idea of keeping Kansas a free state is a man named John Brown, and he becomes very important during the 1850s. He's an abolitionist, but that's kind of an understatement, because he's not just your normal, everyday, I'm going to give a speech abolitionist. He's the kind of abolitionist that will happily murder slave owners or arm the slaves so they can do it themselves. He does not believe in sort of peaceful resolution to these issues. So he goes to Kansas to try and help the free soilers, or the people who want Kansas to be a free state. And he brings guns and lots of people to try and help. And he sort of leads some of the more violent charges of the Kansas events. The North believes that the policy of free labor that they have, where workers can set the value of their own labor based on the fact that if they don't like how much they're being paid, let's say they're being paid too little to work in a factory and they don't like that, there is always the option of becoming a small farmer. The United States has enough land and enough soil that's available to people that they can use that as an outlet. And the argument here is that if places like Kansas become a slave state, and if other new territories become a slave state, that the opportunity for people to appreciate the free labor market will start to disappear. It's a pretty powerful argument for a lot of people in the North, but the South doesn't buy it at all. The South doesn't believe that slavery damages the overall economy of a region. They point to their own economy, at least for most of the 1840s and 50s, and say, hey, we're doing just fine. But Northerners, by contrast, will point to the number of very poor white Southern farmers and renters and say, well, your economy only works well for the very rich. You have this tiny group of people who are doing really well, and everybody else is out of luck. And they blame slavery for that problem. They start talking about things like internal improvements and industry, and they say, look, you don't have any of this. You rely on this one-trick pony, and that's all you've got. And that's dangerous, and it doesn't help capitalism, it doesn't help democracy, that you guys have your own little system where just these few people are in charge and just these few people are the richest, and that's not how it's supposed to work. This is one of the reasons why the Civil War is about just more than slavery. Obviously, slavery is the fuel under this particular debate, but there's more to this debate than just, is it okay to have slaves or not? This debate is about what direction the United States is heading in. It's about what our economic policies should be, what we expect of workers, what we expect of landowners, and who we expect to share in the profitability of the United States. And a lot of that starts to come out here. And by the mid-1850s, the economy in the South has started to stagnate, which means that it's not growing and it's not failing, but it's just It's just kind of middling about. And so Republicans and Northerners in this context are saying, well, look, you guys have done as much as you can do. You have grown with slavery and cotton as much as you can, and now you have no place else to go. But look at us. We have no place to go but up. And that is a pretty damaging argument here. What we see is panic starting to set in. Southerners know that their economy isn't growing as fast as it was a decade ago. They also know that abolitionism is becoming more popular in the North, and it's harder to defend slavery against some of these charges. They keep arguing that slavery is a good thing. They do not make apologies for it anymore at this point. They're just kind of saying, look, this is how it's going to be. It's all of the justifications that they've already made kind of rolled into one. They're tired of being apologetic about the institution of slavery. The South views itself as a more natural way of getting things done. They look at the North and charge that not only do Northerners treat their factory workers like junk, they are forcing them to work in a way that isn't natural. They've got all these machines, and they've got all this steam power, and they're doing all of this stuff that turns people into machinery. And they're making the case that because their slaves work a natural cycle, sun up to sundown, seasonally, that this is the traditional American way of work. And that the North is the one that is stepping away from traditional American work values by industrializing, by making all of these changes. Right in the middle of all this drama, Kansas, Nebraska gets really bad around 1854, 1855. And then in 1856, we have to have a presidential election. Talk about a tense time for somebody to take office. In 1856, there is almost a tie. Ties in an election are dangerous at the presidential level. It causes conflict and problem. And we don't need any more conflict or problem here in the 1850s. We have people shooting each other in Kansas about the issue of slavery and sovereignty. The election of 1856, it's a close vote, but there is a winner. James Buchanan is going to be the winner. He will spend the next 4 years doing pretty much absolutely nothing about what's going on around him. And as if we needed any more stuff happening to generate chaos, we get something else. Actually, we get a couple other things. We get the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave whose owner lived in Missouri. Missouri is a slave state during this time. Although not a heavily populated slave state, a lot of people in Missouri didn't have slaves at all. But Dred Scott is a slave whose Missouri owner took him to the Minnesota Territory to work and then brought him back to Missouri. So this man traveled with the slave, brought the slave back home when they were done working. And Dred Scott sues, which is interesting just in and of itself, by saying that when his owner took him to the Minnesota Territory, he automatically became free. Because remember, Minnesota is being carved out of the Northwest Territories. The Northwest Ordinances dictate that that has to be free territory. And so Dred Scott says, well, I went there, he took me there, that made me free. This is going to go through the court system. It goes through the Missouri courts, and ultimately in 1857, it ends up at the door of the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court not only disagrees with Dred Scott, but they take a position that is fairly extreme. They say, Dred Scott, you're not free. Sorry. That doesn't count. He brought you back to Missouri. It's not like he dropped you off in a free territory and left you there. So your case isn't going to happen. But they don't just stop there. They don't just decide about Dred Scott. They go farther. And it's the step farther that they take that really creates a ton of problem. The next step is, not only is Dred Scott not free, but slave owners are allowed to take their property anywhere they want. That the federal government has no right, and the states have no right to tell somebody where they can and cannot take their property. And the decision in Dred Scott actually equates slaves to horses. They say, well, you wouldn't tell a man he couldn't bring his horse to Minnesota, so you can't tell him that he's not going to bring his slave. This totally repeals all of the decisions that have been made so far about how you decide who gets to be a free state and who's going to be a slave state. Because the Supreme Court has said it doesn't matter what you decide. People's personal property, including human property, can be taken anywhere. If you want to take slaves to California, have at it. If you want to take slaves to Ohio, be our guest. The Supreme Court's decision makes people in the North so horrified that I can't really explain it to you. They are outraged, simply outraged that all of the work that's been done by states and by Congress to dictate where slavery will be and where it will not be has just been undone by a decision that the court didn't even need to make. All the court needed to do was say, Dred Scott, you're free or you're not. And they didn't stop there. They went this step farther, saying, hey, you all can't decide where slavery goes and doesn't go. That's somebody's property, and property goes with its owner. They're also really horrified by the fact that the Supreme Court would go so far as to indicate that human beings are like animals, and human beings are like, it's like a wheelbarrow. Oh, I want to take my wheelbarrow to Indiana. I want to take my slave to Indiana. They're all one and the same according to the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision. And this is why the decision is so troubling for people. At this point in time, Kansas finally has made a decision. It doesn't mean they've stopped shooting at each other, but Kansas has decided on a constitution that does not allow for slavery. And so they petition Congress to be admitted as a free state, and Congress says no. More specifically, the southern members of Congress block the entrance of Kansas here. Now, it's easy to sort of say, yes, Kansas has made a decision. The truth is that these elections and decisions that are taking place in Kansas were really corrupt and fraudulent. It was so important to people that they tried to do whatever necessary to make sure that their side won. So to say that in 1857 Kansas makes kind of a clean decision is wrong. It doesn't. But this is the decision that they stick with because they really don't have anything else to do. But they're going to be made to wait. Actually, Kansas will not be admitted as a free state until the Civil War starts. The Southerners leave at that point, kind of opening the door for Kansas to come in. We didn't need anything else to go wrong, but we're going to get something else to go wrong because John Brown has finished in Kansas terrorizing people in the name of abolitionism. And that really is a picture of him in the upper left. I just wanted you guys to see. I don't know about you, but I am afraid of that picture. It always freaks me out. He has crazy eyes. That beard is weird. And this painting, I think, kind of accurately depicts the actual photograph of him there in the upper left. But at any rate, John Brown decides that the work that he did in Kansas to bring Kansas to kind of a free platform was not enough. He is convinced, again, second great awakening here, that God has told him personally, John Brown, message from God, that he needs to be responsible for liberating the slaves in the South. So his new idea is that this should be done by any means necessary, including violence. So he is going to steal weapons from the federal government at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Harper's Ferry today is actually in West Virginia. He's going to go in to this armory. He's going to steal weapons at the arsenal. And then, after that, he's going to arm slaves so that they can lead their own rebellion and help free themselves. So he leads a group of men, and he gets funding and donations and all kinds of stuff. But the problem is that he gets caught. People in Virginia were very sensitive about guarding this arsenal for this exact reason. They didn't want slaves to get to Harper's Ferry, steal all these weapons, and then go on a rampage. And they didn't want John Brown to do it either. So he gets caught. All of the people who are with him get caught. And 6 of his followers, including himself, are executed as a result of this attempted raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. His sons were included in the number of people who were killed. But there is a famous song, I'm not singing it for you, about John Brown. It's about laying him low in the ground. He becomes a slave hero. He becomes the example of a white person who is literally willing to lay down his life to help the poor slaves in the South get some sort of satisfaction. There is a secondary problem with what John Brown did here. Now, granted, he's taking his abolitionism to an extreme. But the South sees this as a harbinger of things to come, that this sort of foreshadows the lengths that Northerners are willing to go to abolish the system of slavery. So even though this is one guy, and even though they catch him and they kill him, there is growing concern that this sort of thing is going to start to happen more often, and that it's going to result in Southerners not just losing their slaves, but also losing their lives. John Brown was a big fan of the Republican Party during this time, because the Republicans have come out not just in favor of free soil and free labor and a free Kansas, but also they are an anti-slavery party. So John Brown thinks that that's great. But it also makes Southerners that much more afraid of the Republicans, because now they finally have a party who is willing to take a strong position on the issue of slavery. While all of this is going on, we've wrapped up Kansas to some extent. We've got the Dred Scott decision that makes people upset. By the way, the South really loved that Dred Scott decision, just so you know. They were delighted. And this thing with John Brown, this all culminates in an election year. And this is arguably one of the most important elections in American history. And I've put up the election map, which I hardly ever do, because I wanted you to see what it looks like. If you look at the map, it looks like this election went pretty well for Lincoln. Obviously, there's a lot of blue up there. But the truth is that Lincoln doesn't even win half the popular vote. Less than 50% of Americans voted for Abraham Lincoln in 1860. He's going to win anyway, but not with a huge vote of confidence by any stretch of the imagination. In 10 states in the South, he's not even on the ballot. You can't even vote for him. He's not even on there. The Republican Party is not on the ballot in 10 southern states. So you can see that by the election of 1860, we already have a serious problem. Election of Abraham Lincoln or not, we've got an entire political party who is being completely ignored by the South. The Democrats also have a problem because they split. We've got Southern Democrats. You can see the green color here is the Southern Democratic candidate, who obviously is pro-slavery and pro-protecting the South. But there are other Democrats who want to try and find a happy compromise, kind of the middle ground Democrats, and 3 states give their electoral votes to that candidate. He's up here as the Constitutional Union candidate. We also have Missouri. Oh, Missouri. We have Missouri, who gives all of their electoral votes to Stephen Douglas. We had 4 candidates who split the vote. You can see here in this, if you look at the bottom pie, the popular vote, we had about 4.5 million votes cast. Only 40% of those went to Lincoln. 29% of those went to Douglas, who was Lincoln's chief competition, really. And then the South kind of splits the rest of the maybe 30 or so percent of people. So this is kind of a mess. And immediately upon hearing that a Republican has won this election, the South makes plans to secede. And this is it's an interesting process. It's an interesting time, even though we know what all of the bad stuff that's coming down the pipe is going to be. In Texas, just to give you an example, Texas starts talking about seceding as soon as South Carolina does in 1860. They won't do it in 1860. They're about a year behind, but they start discussing it. And Sam Houston was the governor of Texas during that time, and he says, wait a minute. This is a horrible idea. What you guys are suggesting is a horrible idea. We can't beat the North in a war. They'll never let us walk away. We need to just stay here and be Texas and try to stay out of this. And he actually is forced to resign as a result of those comments and his belief that this state of Texas should just stay put. So we don't even have kind of a united Southern front. We got people in the South that think that they shouldn't secede. We have people in the North who believe that slavery should be protected. So there's not a clear line here, even though we're going to draw the North and the South. There is a lot of mixing. We've got people in the South who would prefer to stay in the United States. We have people in the North who think that slave owners have every right to own people. And that kind of comes to pass here as the debates during 1860 really heat up. For a lot of people in the South, they felt like the election of Lincoln indicated that the nation was being sort of taken over by a radical fringe element. And despite of that, enough people in the South supported what looks to be kind of a concessionary position. You know, they supported this idea that, well, we need to stick it out and see what this guy's going to do before we make a decision. So people, were making comments. One of my favorites is somebody who commented, South Carolina is too small for a republic and too big for an insane asylum. And that was from another Southerner. One of the issues at play here is that Abraham Lincoln is coming into office at quite possibly the worst time in American history. And he doesn't even get inaugurated before South Carolina secedes from the Union. You'll notice on this map, this is the secession map, that South Carolina's date is December of 1860. In the months that follow, you can see January and February for Texas, and then later for the Mid-South. A lot of states will wait until South Carolina does it, and then they follow suit. By the time that Lincoln is inaugurated, the peach-colored states down here, the Deep South, they are already gone. And by the time he gets into office and tries to get settled in, he loses the Mid-South, those blue states. The attack on Fort Sumter doesn't come until April of 1861. So you can see here the Mid-South, that blue line, those states make their decision after Fort Sumter actually commences. But Lincoln isn't really able to sort of step in and stop them from leaving. And you might be wondering possibly, President Buchanan is in office until Lincoln is officially inaugurated. What is his response to states trying to leave the Union? Well, there isn't one. He says his actual opinion goes a little something like this. He thought that it was illegal for them to leave, but he didn't know what he could do to stop them. So he thinks they're wrong, but he also doesn't think it's okay for him to do anything about it. Thank you, President Buchanan, for that interesting take on the issue. When we come back for the next section, we are going to start the Civil War. We're going to look at where the two sides kind of fit, what resources they bring to the table, and what is going to happen to provide us with the outcome that we end up with in 1865. You have been